3. You've probably done so already, but take out your outline and look at the executive summary. This module is going to cover the nature of contracts, their key elements, and their relationship to the contractor licensing law, which is 489. We're also going to look at Florida Statute 713, which is the lien law, and we're going to be using the AIA documents, the model documents, to illustrate some of the features involved in typical construction relationships. Now, it may help you as we start this to consider the background that came to be our legal system in the country so that we can understand how contracts and some of the other features that you'll be studying fall into place. And to understand the American legal system, we really have to go backwards in time to England and what was happening in England, because we have put together our system based on traditions that came forward from that legal system in England. And the legal system in England evolved from an economic order that was known as feudalism. And in a feudalistic society, there were really two things that were going on. On one side, you had the king and the court, and on the other side, you had the landowner or the lord of a manor, and he owned a section of land which was called a field. And he exchanged the fact that he was in a position to provide security and provide protection for people to work the fjord for him. And the people who worked the fjord were regarded as serfs. That was their name. It may interest you to know that the way serfs measured their wealth one against another was the height of the dung pile on the side of their hut, because dung was a building material and also a fuel. However, the two things that were happening at this time was the king in the court and the lord in the manor. And in the king in the court, what was important was ritual. And as ritual evolved and the written language evolved, what came to be the tradition that unfolded here was the tradition of the statutory law, the written law, in which you have rules of protocol, much like dance steps in a dance, that are to be followed. And these rules tend to be black and white because they are written in the form of a statute. Now, our licensing law is directly from this tradition. It's a statutory type of law, as is criminal law, for example. However, the other tradition that was occurring in the countryside with the lord of the manor was these individual serfs would get into disputes, and they would look to the lord of the manor to resolve these disputes. Hey, a pig just broke out of the pen and ate the food of the neighbor, and the two would be at it, and they would come to the lord, and the lord would have to make a decision. Now, although these lords were powerful, they could not make decisions that were unacceptable to these serfs. And so the key question they would ask is, well, what do you expect me to do? What is traditional in this situation? What should be done? And this became and evolved into what we would call the common law. The common law is not black and white. It is interpretive law. It consists of the sum of all the thinking that went on about those types of issues in recorded time, and also all the general senses that the community brings to bear on a legal situation. Now, the reason why it's important to understand these two relationships is because sometimes when we look at the rules that we're to follow, we can get confused as to whether we are looking at a black and white statutory consideration or we are looking to an interpretive situation. And contracting law is essentially an interpretive situation. It's a study of the interrelationships between people and their promises. And although there are some aspects of statutes that affect contracting law, such as a statute called the Statute of Fraud, which defines which contracts must be in writing, or a statute such as a Statute of Limitations that says, gee, some issues after time goes by are no longer legitimate issues to bring forward. We see these statutory laws impinging on the contracting elements, and we might get confused and think that we're dealing with black and white circumstances, and we're not. So the entire subject of contracts must be looked at within the idea that we are dealing with an evolving circumstance, a fluid circumstance, and what we look to are general principles. Now, looking at your outline, we're going to take a look at this issue of contracts. And what might help us is, in your module, you have several exhibits, and the first three exhibits that you have in your module are all entitled Contracting Law, and then Part 2 and Part 3. So turn to those exhibits, and let's take a look at this subject of contracts And one note is, you'll notice on the outline itself, we have page numbers representing the different topics that I'm going to be discussing via the exhibits. Once again, your job is to, after listening to the video, go back through the outline and mark those pages in your book. My job is to try to explain this stuff to you in such a way that it's easy for you to assimilate. And hopefully if we both do our jobs, this will become relatively straightforward and you'll easily be able to answer questions on the exam about it. The subject of contracts is covered in your contractor's manual in chapter number 8. And as we go through this information from your handouts, it can be a good idea to have chapter 8 out and see if you can locate things by virtue of where they would fit in the table of contents. Your first appendix or exhibit is called General Contract Law, and it again indicates that this is reference to chapter 8 of your contractor's manual. And here visually we see the three parts of a contract. We have an offer, an acceptance, and consideration. An offer is somebody indicating that they wish to engage into a contract. And for this contract to move forward, these two other factors have to be in place. The first factor that has to be in place is acceptance. And you'll notice that item number 1 here indicates that the acceptance must be unconditional. Any change from the original offer changes the entire status of the arrangement. If, for example, a contractor invites a bidder to come in and the bidder changes the conditions of the proposal, then that is really a counter offer. In order for an acceptance to occur, there must be no changes to the original offer. Consideration are promises or items of value. There must be something valuable to be gained or lost in the arrangement. And so with a perfect acceptance and with something of value, the offer then becomes a contract. Now notice that there are many types of potential offers. For example, we have number 1 here as a bid. A bid can be represented as an offer. The purchase of something can be representative of an offer. Perhaps a good example of this is if you're walking through a food line in a cafeteria. Credit application can also be viewed as an offer. The proposal itself can be used as an offer. And interestingly enough, sometimes a termination can reflect itself as an offer. The point is that in your reference book, these 5 things are mentioned, and they pertain to the different styles of making an offer. You'll notice also in this handout, we have a summary of the general contract documents, and these have already been gone over in the text of our presentation here. And as we mentioned, there are some statutes that do relate to contracts. And the statutes often have to do with certain particular issues, such as the issue of should a contract be in writing. Well, there's a difference between the should and must. Some contracts must be in writing because a statute, known as the Statute of Frauds, say they must be in writing. Most contracts, or all contracts, should be in writing if the goal of the agreement is to be clear and perhaps defensible later on. But amongst those items that must be in writing, any contract that has a duration for over 1 year, any contract which promises to take care of a debt for another, the sale of real property, a lease that is expected to take over a year or something with a term over 1 year, goods that are sold with a value in excess of $500, and an agreement for arbitration to occur. So these are the 6 items that are required to be in writing for them to be valid under the Statute of Frauds. But in general, in this topic of contracts, you can see that there are many different relationships, many different offers and acceptances and combinations of these features that could be said to be a contract. The next exhibit, General Contract Law 2, has some other features of interest. The first one in the upper left-hand corner refers to the Statutes of Limitation. Here is another example of a statute imposing rules on the contractual relationship. And essentially this says that certain types of contracts expire if they're not acted on within a certain period of time. And they're listed here 1 through 6. A breach of a written contract, you have 5 years to actually bring an action in a case like that. For an oil contract, you have 4 years. For design, planning, or construction, you have 4 years. To recover wages, 2 years. A mechanic's lien is 1 year, or if the lien is contested, 60 days. And an action on a payment bond is 1 year. In addition to the general principle of contracts, there are some structural aspects of contracts as well. The Contractor's Manual points to these structural aspects of contracts. One way of contracting, and the way in which we're most familiar, is called a prime contract, where a specific contractor is selected, a general contractor, who runs the entire job. This item number 1 stands in contrast with item number 4, multiple prime contracts. In this case, you might have 3 or 4 general contractors, each one responsible for a particular zone of the work, and then, of course, each one of them having inside their agreement a mechanism for coordination to occur between the different prime contractors. Linear construction and phase construction are related. Linear construction says this: you plan the entire thing and then you execute it. Phase construction says this: you plan a little bit, execute. While you're executing, you plan the next phase. Then you execute the next phase and keep planning as you're going. In other words, phase construction is considered fast track. You're planning as you're going. Linear construction is considered slower because you wait for everything to be planned before you start. Turnkey and design build are popular contracting methods. Turnkey basically says, hey, give me the contract, and the next thing you'll have to do is just to turn the key to walk inside. And construction management is outlined in the Contractor's Manual. But as a reality point, you need to be very careful about what you call construction management. The Construction Industry Licensing Board has specific opinions as to whether license holders can easily become construction managers and avoid, or in their view, evade some of the responsibilities that they have as contractors. So you're going to want to get with your advisors to determine how you will approach contracting. But the Contractor's Manual indicates that these 6 items relate to project and contract structure. According to the Contractor's Manual, there are a number of provisions in a contract that ought to be there. Most of these are common sense, but of course this is the common sense that's not so common. Name, and the licensing law says we should have our license number on these contracts. Number 2 is critical, the scope of work, and this can be anything from a simple statement to a very involved level of documentation. Generally speaking, the more clear the relationship, the better, and therefore it is vital that you clarify exactly what the scope of work might be. For example, having a scope of work that says, I will paint the building, is not very specific. What type of paint is to be used, what type of preparation, how many coats of the paint, who will select the colors, and so forth, would all be included if we wanted a complete scope of work for painting a building. Compensation, of course, is what we are interested in: how much, when, and what will be withheld. The word retainage means withheld. And remember that in the first chapter of Walker's, there's a little notation that says that usually retainage is set at one level, and then as the contract proceeds, the retainage is reduced to a lower level. Warranties are also part of contracts, and remember that there are warranties that are written into a contract, and these are called expressed. And then there are some warranties that you have, or you wind up having, by virtue of the nature of what it is that you're doing. And in Florida, this is particularly strong. In Florida, there's a generally accepted principle of what is called merchantability, or fitness for a particular purpose. So that if you go to the Coke machine and buy a Coca-Cola, you can expect that it's not going to explode in your hands. It does not have to express that the can will not explode. It's enough that in the general course of human conduct, we can make certain expectations, and we expect that the Coca-Cola can is not going to explode. In the same way, we build a house, it's expected that certain things are going to hold up. The first rain, for example, if it's a normal rain, shouldn't wash away the roof. And even though we have not expressed a warranty in that area, an implication is there for that warranty and will be held to it. The relationships of the participants, who is to do what, the responsibilities of the participants should be put in a contract. The schedule of events, the selection of material. changes and the process for changing the contract. Unintended changes, by the way, are referred to as constructive changes in your contractor's manual. But what happens if unintended changes are required? What happens if the site conditions are at variance with what has been suggested? What will be the relationship between the lien laws and this contract? What happens, number 12, if there is a default in this contract? And there's a concept here called liquidated damages that is to be looked at here. And the idea is this: if somebody defaults in a contract, the other party is injured. And the choices are either to set a value to that injury up front, or to submit to a process where some third party will determine what the injury was. To avoid courts and so forth, many contracts will include a pre-calculation of what is going to happen if the contract is broken. And so, in liquidated damages, there's a value given to the cost of the breaking of the contract, so that at the end of the rainbow, somebody can just write a check, and that's the end of the whole relationship. So liquidated damages are usually used in terms of what will happen if the contract is concluded later than when it was supposed to be. And you're familiar with these because they're generally assessed at so much per day. So if you were supposed to be done with the contract on the 10th but didn't complete until the 15th, you broke the contract if the 10th was the deadline. And so rather than go through a situation where a third party determines the damages, there might be a liquidated damages provision in the contract where you can simply calculate what the damages were, write the check, and that's the end of it. How disputes are resolved should be in a contract. In the AIA documents, as well as the contracting law, there are provisions for arbitration. In the AIA documents, there's a provision also for mediation. The difference between the two has to do with the role of the process. The mediation role is to try to get the parties to come to a meeting of the minds. The arbitration role is a process that will come up with a decision based on the claims of the participants. And finally, item number 14, exculpatory clauses. The word exculpate comes from the same root as the word scalpel. Both of them mean to cut out. An exculpatory clause is one that cuts something out. Generally, these clauses are used to reduce liability, and in your contractor's manual, they refer to a hold harmless or indemnification clause, and they suggest that you include these in your contracts because they will cut out a portion of your liability. The hold harmless clause says, hey, you're not going to blame me for anything, and the indemnify clause says, hey, you're going to keep me out of the hot seat here. You're going to say that I'm not responsible for anything that occurs. And another one that is often used is will defend. So you can indemnify, hold harmless, and defend. If you had those exculpatory clauses in your contract, in theory, that other person would have to defend you from claim, not hold you harmful in any event, and actually defend you in the event that a claim is pursued. And that's what is meant by exculpatory clauses. Now take a look on your outline to the top of page 2, topic number 1-4. So you see a number 4 on the top of page 2, contract documents. Now you'll notice that on the outline, it refers you to some pages in the contractor's manual and also to some pages in Walker's Guide to Estimating. And all of these particular items that are listed here are all referenced in these materials, and you want to identify them in your materials. However, I want to take you through a discussion of them right now. So in contract documents, we're talking about the pieces of paper that routinely are part of a contracting process. And these pieces of paper essentially break down into bidding documents, the composition of papers that go in with a bid, and then finally the execution documents, the entire package that would include all bidding documents, plus any other supplementary documents which would compose the contract and the contract documents, the entire umbrella of all of the agreements and circumstances under which work is to be done. Now, in the section of bidding documents, you have a number of items here which are listed A through J. You have an invitation, you have instructions, you have general conditions, you have supplementary conditions. It is going to be important for you to know where to find the distinction between general and supplementary conditions. These are listed in page numbers on your outline. Generally speaking, general conditions are those that would apply to any job, and supplementary conditions will be those that will apply to your particular job. Supplementary conditions would include those things that are expected to be needed and required on a particular job that is about to get underway. Another item, which usually is taken to be the only item, but is not, is item E, plans and drawings. These are also part of the contract documents. F, details on the plans are likewise included. And G, the written information that outlines specifically what is to be done, the specifications, are included. And if we have not yet gone over it, you will find that in the rules of interpreting contracts, the idea is the more specific governs, and of E, F, and G, the specifications are the more specific document. And so, in fact, the specifications are the senior document in a contracting relationship. And alas, many contractors neglect to read specifications. Some architect friends of mine routinely put provisions in specifications that are totally undoable, such as host a party in Unit 304, or bring non-existent supplies to another location. And they do this to see if the contractors are actually reading the specs, and sadly enough, many of them do not read the specifications. Later on, if things become confusing or if there are conflicts, these contractors are very disappointed to find out what they really signed into when they signed on to the original contract. Another piece of paper that's included is called an addenda. Addenda are simply changes to the originally conceived documents. Now, the word addenda is used in the bidding process to represent changes occurring to the bidding process. The word change order is used to describe changes that occur after the contract is signed. So addenda are changes pre-signing, change orders and change directives are changes post-signing. The original proposal entertained would be included, which is topic I. And any type of bonds and bond requirement would also be included in this point. Now, also remember from our previous conversation that in the process of bidding, if a bid comes forward, it must be exactly as issued. Any change to that bid, any change to the documents as they were issued, when the bidder returns with the bid, really is not a bid to the original documents at all. It is a substitution request, okay? So in order to have a completed cycle, you have bid documents which are conclusive. You have a bidder that has, in theory, reviewed and accepts all aspects of all documents and submits a bid based on agreeing with all of these aspects. Any change to that, any change on the part of the bidder that is not accepted before the bid is applied, is actually a counter-offer to the contract and is not an acceptance of the original contract as written. To look at topic number B here, execution documents, you have change orders and change directives. The difference of the two is this. A change order is something that is agreed upon by all three principal parties, the owner, the architect, and the contractor. There may be, however, situations where the owner and the architect want the contractor to do something, whether or not the contractor agrees with it or not. They can accomplish this by issuing a change directive. Now the contractor is directed to do what the owner and architect want him or her to do. And the contractor must go forward and complete the change directive. But what if the contractor